Today I'm going to talk about War Plan Orange, which was the United States plan for a war with Japan. When the First World War came to an end in 1918, there were five major naval powers in existence: Great Britain, the United States, Japan, France, and Italy. But of these five, only the first three really had what can be described as being first-line navies and the capacity to build and expand them should the need arise. In Great Britain's case, in 1918 she had an unsurpassed experience of naval warfare, having fought the Germans since 1914 in the North Sea and the Atlantic. She had lots of new ships planned to be built should the war have continued, and some of them were very revolutionary designs, particularly the new fast battleships and battle cruisers. She also had new types in the pipeline, particularly aircraft carriers. However, the merchant navy had suffered horrendous losses, and these would need to be replaced, and that was going to take away some of the shipbuilding capacity that would have been available had the Royal Navy needed to expand. Furthermore, much of the building capacity was obsolete, worn out, and desperately in need of investment and/or replacement. On top of that, the country was suffering major economic and social problems, mainly as a result of the huge strain that had been put on the economy by the sheer cost and expense in human terms of fighting the First World War. On the other hand, the United States had had lots of practical experience working alongside the Royal Navy, particularly on the Atlantic and towards the end of the war in the North Sea. They had huge shipbuilding potential, which had developed very rapidly from 1914 onwards. They had lots of new ships planned or in production, many of them to standardized designs. And I'm thinking here of the standard battleships, the the four-funneled destroyers and the four-funneled cruisers. Furthermore, they had also recognized the potential of air power. Japan, on the other hand, had benefited from its long links with the Royal Navy, particularly in terms of its organisation, the sort of ships designs it used, and so on. But in actual fact, it had very little experience of recent naval warfare. Its last major naval war events against the Russians before 1910. It had had some experience escorting convoys across the Indian Ocean, and it had been involved in the siege of Tsingtao on the Chinese mainland from the Germans. But other than that, no great naval experience of warfare. However, they did have lots of new ships planned, particularly the 8+8 capital ship plan. So why is the Pacific important? Why is it going to be the arena for the next naval war? Well, simply, the North Sea and the Atlantic were where the First War was mainly fought, and of course there's now no major naval power operating in that area except Great Britain. France, Italy, they're more looking at each other in the Mediterranean. Britain, no major threat in the North Sea and the Atlantic. The only place where there is a threat is the Pacific, because Japan's growing power, both on land and at sea, is putting a major threat on British and American spheres of influence, the colonies, their trading routes, and so on in the Far East. Now, before things became ridiculous, all the powers sat down to have discussions about the future of naval developments, as a result of which we had the Washington Treaty. However, I'm going to assume the Washington Treaty doesn't take place. And what we end up with is a new naval arms race. What would have happened in Britain? Well, First of all, the Royal Navy would have had to have a major sheep and goats exercise. All those obsolete ships that had been kept built, even during the First World War, would have had to have been scrapped or at least taken out of service. Certainly all the old pre-dreadnoughts, the armoured cruisers, the early light cruisers, the protected cruisers, they would have all gone. She would have instead concentrated building more fast battleships and battle cruisers, aircraft carriers, but with a very specific task. Those aircraft carriers would have been there to protect the fleet from enemy air attacks, and also to act as spotters for the main battle line of battleships and battle cruisers. There would also have been a need to have a large number of large and small cruisers, both to protect and interdict trade, and submarines. The Royal Navy had learnt to their cost how effective submarine warfare could be. The United States, well, they would have continued to build their standardised battleships and battle cruisers, probably building them bigger and better, but probably not much faster, because they thought that armament and armour were more important than speed. They also would have built aircraft carriers, but their aircraft carriers would have been tasked more with an attack or strike role than a protective or spotting role. They would have concentrated on long-range cruisers, mainly to act as a scouting force for the battleships and also to interdict any opponent's trade routes. Long-range submarines would have performed a similar function, and this all was encapsulated into what became War Plan Orange. The Japanese, on the other hand, they would have concentrated on quality rather than quantity. They knew they didn't have the capacity to outbuild the Americans, so what they would have done is concentrated on building the biggest, best, and wherever possible, fastest battleships and battle cruisers they could, supported by a fleet of aircraft carriers, not converted as they did from redundant hulls of battleships and battle cruisers, but from the keel up. They would have also had long-range cruisers, again to protect the battle line, to scout ahead of it, and to interdict enemy trade. Again, long-range submarines with the range to go right across the Pacific to attack American shipping along the coast of America, along the west coast of America, and possibly even as far as the Panama Canal. And they would have had long-range torpedoes. These were seen as an essential part of the armament of the lighter units of the Japanese Navy. And this was all encapsulated in what they'd called the Kantai Kessen, or the Decisive Battle Doctrine. Now, the Decisive Battle Doctrine was to allow the United States to cross the Pacific, harassed and weakened by constant pinprick attacks by submarines and aircraft carrier strike forces. These aircraft carriers probably being escorted by destroyers and cruisers, but not by battleships. The intention was to weaken them as they came across the Pacific, and then to engage them in a decisive battleship versus battleship battle somewhere near the Japanese homeland. Surprisingly, War Plan Orange was not that dissimilar. The Americans expected that there would be a blockade of the Philippines and other territories that they had in the Far East. Their primary goal would be to protect the Panama Canal. This was to allow the elements of the Atlantic Fleet through to reinforce the Pacific Fleet, which would concentrate on the west coast and in Hawaii. Once the fleet had been concentrated, it would sail west to raise the blockades of the Philippines and other islands, to then engage the Japanese in the decisive fleet action, again in the Japanese homelands, with the intention of imposing a blockade on the Japanese islands. The Americans knew how effective a maritime blockade could be because they'd seen how effective it was in the North Sea, and how the blockade had actually brought Germany to its knees rather than the decisive land battle. So if we look at both these two war plans, there is a considerable overlap of these plans, and this was recognised by people outside of those two nations, particularly by naval experts such as Hector Bywater. And I thoroughly recommend to anybody who has an interest of any sort in the potential war in the Pacific before 1941 to read his book, War in the Pacific. Interestingly, both sides wargamed their respective plans almost on an annual basis during the 1920s and 1930s, although in actual fact the United States Navy called some of theirs fleet problems and actually turned these into practical at-sea war games as well as land-based ones. Each time they'd use them, they refined them that little bit more. So, War Plan Orange, America's plan to defeat Japan. Interesting to think how close it was to the eventual strategy that they used.